We will begin by going to 1939. It is traditionally considered the date of the beginning of the Second World War, more precisely September 1st of that year, and the day when Germany attacked Poland. This statement, of course, has a sense of being, but with each passing year after the war, the history of the Second World War is becoming more profound, and the consequences are better studied. More and more documents are being deciphered, and historians of different countries have their own opinion on certain issues. The date of the outbreak of World War II has been widely debated in all countries in recent years. For example, one of the alternative dates is May 1939, when the Soviet Union and Japan clashed on the Mongolian-Manchurian border. The battles at Khalkhin Gol were very large and, for example, much larger than the individual battles of World War II, because almost 60,000 people from the USSR fought, and the Japanese side numbered 75,000. Losses from various sources are also estimated in tens of thousands, and the impact on the Second World War and the clash was very powerful. The crushing defeat of Japan was another brick because of which this country decided to turn its attention to the Pacific Ocean. We must not forget the war in China, which began in 1937. Its description makes the blood run cold. There are chemical weapons and Unit 731, and the insane war crimes of the Japanese army. Even modest sources estimate the civilian losses at 12 million, and according to China, the total number of victims reached 35 million. There is the Italo-Ethiopian War, the Slovak-Hungarian War, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, all of which participated in the Second World War. Yes, so it is not a myth that the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, but do not assume that everyone lived in neutrality before that. In fact, at the beginning of the 30s, the world was already plunged into the abyss of conflicts, and some of them were striking in scale. The next topic of conversation is already the name of the total myth. And this is the myth that the Second World War was a completely mechanized conflict of high technology at that time. Tanks against planes, submarines against battleships, and other film images, of course. But do not forget that, as in the case of the First World War, a huge amount of military equipment began to appear a little later, when the countries completely switched to a military mode, and even in this case, the good old horses continued to play a key role, and even more so at the beginning of the war. In the German army, for example, in 1939, 514,000 horses served, which is 3 times more than the number of mechanized transport units. At the peak, the number of active horses in the German army exceeded 1 million, and almost 3 million of them went through the war. At the peak of the war, almost every infantry division had a separate reconnaissance battalion of 200 cavalrymen. Needless to say, the situation was similar in other countries. Moreover, Soviet cavalry battalions on horseback took part in the offensive against Manchuria in August 1945. In general, there were classics in the Second World War, and this unwittingly gave birth to a second myth related to Poland. Everyone knows how quickly the country was captured, and most people have scenes in their heads of poor Polish cavalrymen marching on tanks with sabers. Such words can even be found in textbooks, and this is of course a complete myth, based on the real Battle of Krajanta. But of course the Poles were not idiots and did not rush at the tanks with pikes. Because there were no tanks there, they arrived at the end. But in reality, the Polish cavalrymen scattered the Germans with the first attack, and there was even an order to organize a retreat, which was cancelled only by General Guderian, who ordered to put on machine guns and bring armored vehicles. By the way, the Poles also had something to knock out in this battle. They had anti-tank guns and rifles in their arsenal. The German army simply proved to be stronger and technically crushed the enemy, and then used the victory to create the myth of stupid Poles who went to the tanks with sabers. Since we are talking about Poland, let's mention other small countries. History is written by the winners, and over time, terrible things can happen to them. Even which country suffered the most terrible burden is forgotten, and textbooks usually don't mention small participants like Hungary and Romania and Yugoslavia at all. But meanwhile, the losses of Romania in World War II were more than Britain and France combined, and that's only if you count the troops together with the civilians, not like Poland, but even Yugoslavia lost more than France and Britain combined. The whole of Yugoslavia also mobilized more people during the war than Italy, and Hungary lost more soldiers than France. More people in Greece died in World War II than Americans, and loss is a very sad and difficult subject that frankly does not come to the surface. We just hope that the world does not remember myths and movies, but the terrible statistics and the full picture of events. We will not even mention the fact that the Allied landings in Normandy are supposed to be the defining moment of World War II. We hope that such obvious things do not need to be explained. Let's talk about another movie myth, which has to do with the fact that in almost every movie, you can see orderly lines of volunteers going off to war. In reality, it was much sadder. In the United States, according to the American National Museum, only 38% of the soldiers in World War II were volunteers, and almost two-thirds were drafted against their will, for example, during the Vietnam War, which in popular culture is inextricably linked with uprisings against war and movements. It should be noted, of course, that the absolute number of those who served in World War II is higher, and this factor also plays a role. But still, as a percentage, there was enough patriotism from the Marvel movies with Captain America. Let's also talk about Lend-Lease. Often on the internet, you can find photos of buttons and other equipment proving that the USSR was able to win only thanks to the help of the Americans. The fact of Lend-Lease is, of course, indisputable and has its place. Moreover, the second in number of victories, Soviet pilot Grigory Andreevich Rechkalov made many successful flights on the R-39 Air Cobra. But the overwhelming most sources forget that the bulk of Lend-Lease goods arrived in the USSR in 1943 and after. According to a recent study on Lend-Lease in 2012, the USSR bought goods for $741 million in 1941 and received $1,000 for $540. And this is logical because there were terrible problems with logistics. In 1942, almost 30% of the volume of Lend-Lease was received, but the vast majority of more than 70% in the USSR was seen after 1943, which is very, very cool. But still, it is not worth exaggerating the role of Lend-Lease in World War II, or at least do not forget to pay attention to other figures, according to which the USSR generally received 27% of total aid, while the UK is almost 70%. Let's talk about atomic bombs. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the climax of World War II, and of course, their effects are greatly exaggerated. In the first place, the United States had already carried out large-scale bombing of 66 Japanese cities before the first atomic bomb exploded. For buildings and people, it is not so important whether they are destroyed by fire or atomic bombs. On March 10, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers attacked Tokyo, creating a living hell. The damage was comparable to that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ashes, and aerial maps before and after the bombing look no less frightening, and that was only on March 10th. Earlier, on February 23rd, 1744 bombers had dropped the bombs, and if you look at the entire history of Tokyo, it was destroyed in 1944, and there were no fewer cities in Japan that were similarly razed to the ground. Yes, the atomic bombings had a psychological effect, among other things, but most historians agree that the main reason for Japan's surrender was the entry of the USSR into the war. For a long time, the myth circulated among the masses that the Germans themselves were close to creating an atomic bomb, which is also fundamentally false. It is worth separating the concepts of rockets and bombs directly. The Germans really had rockets ahead of the entire planet, but it did not work with the atom. For detailed explanations, it is better to turn to the channels of physicists. But the established point of view in the scientific community says that the Germans initially chose the wrong path of development in their nuclear program, and even at the end of the war, their reactor in Haigerloch had not started working, although the same Americans were already preparing to test fully functional atomic bombs. Of course, the sad situation at the front played a role for Germany. But still, most physicists believe that with the progress available in 1943, the Germans would have needed another 5 to 10 years to fully master the technology. And even that was not a fact, because supply chains were already beginning to crack by that time. But let's end our topic with the resistance. In the movies, you can often see brave Frenchmen who joined the partisans all over the country to fight the Germans. In reality, 0.5% of the country's population was seen actively resisting the invaders, and according to the Western expert in this matter, Robert Paxton, most of these actions ended in failure, in his opinion, as well as in the opinion of even the complete absence of the French resistance would not have affected the outcome of World War II, although it does not negate the fact of the heroism of its participants. The partisans of Belarus played a much greater role. Ukraine and the RSFSR, and if we talk about Europe, the Yugoslavs staged bacchanals there. These are only the republics of Ujid and Bihać, founded by partisans right on the territories conquered by the Germans, and the republics were quite large, and it was 41 and 42 years ago, the time of the peak of the power of the German army, and in general, we warmly advise everyone to familiarize themselves with the participation in the Second World War. Not only the great powers, but also the smaller European countries, because it was very hot there, even in terms of statistics and figures. That's probably the end of it. Of course, these are not all myths about the Second World War. It is very difficult to talk about this war, but nevertheless, its victims and heroic deeds must be remembered, at least in order not to repeat them, even if, unfortunately, mankind will probably not succeed in doing so. Thank you for being with us until the end. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any interesting new releases. Your comments are very important to us. Share your thoughts below. See you in the next videos.